It's good to be with you. My name's Paul Coulter. I work with an organization called Living Leadership. I'm based in Northern Ireland, so the part of Ireland that is still within the United Kingdom, in a place called Lisburn. And I'm involved in the forum in co-leading the Foundational Apologetics Network, but also do some speaking occasionally for other networks and in workshops like this. So the title of the workshop is We Can't Compete. And really, I think it's important to say at the outset that this workshop will not be the final word on this subject. I know that that's true. I think that's true of every workshop on any subject, but it's probably especially true for me speaking on this subject. It's something that I continue to think about, to wrestle with in some ways. And yet I think it's actually a very, very important issue for us. I would go as far as to say, I think this is one of the things that is least examined, one of the issues, one of the topics that is least examined for us as Christians, as people in Christian ministry, and maybe especially as evangelicals. So I hope that that will become clear as we explore the subject together, but also I really do want to hear from you if you have some suggestions, some thoughts, some responses to what I say, because I think we can learn together. So I want to begin just, if you have the outline there, we will follow the outline, but just a few years ago, quite a number of years ago now, I was at a conference for young Christian men. I was probably one of the young Christian men in those days. And I heard a speaker who had come from North America to speak here in Northern Ireland. And he did a very good job of describing some problems as he saw them amongst young men, saying that too often they spend too much of their time playing computer games and they're wasting their time and they should make better use of their time. A lot of that I thought he was very insightful and was very true, but I was waiting to see what his solution was, what his answer to the problem was. And the answer that he gave was this. He said, work hard and get ahead of the other guys. And then he went on to say something, I can't quote it exactly because I didn't write it down, although I remember these words exactly, something along the lines, I didn't get where I am by being lazy, without working hard. Now, I don't know what you think about that statement. For me, when I think if he had simply said work hard, I would say, yes, I agree. The Bible has a lot to say about that. But I would also want to say rest well and practice a good rhythm of Sabbath and so on. But it's the line, get ahead of the other guys, that really struck me. Now, that speaker, sadly, a few years afterwards, had quite a significant fall from the ministry that he was involved in at the time. And I wonder how much of these values actually contributed that were there for some time before to those problems. But it stuck with me, this idea that we have to work hard, but not just work hard, get ahead of the other people in ministry. So I want us to begin by reflecting a little bit on this question of competitiveness, because we see it everywhere around us, whether we see it in education, where our work is graded by comparison with other people. We see it in employment. We go for a job, we have to interview and compete against other people. We see it in business, where we're measuring the success of a business by the profit, and we have competitive marketplace. And of course, if that isn't enough, in our spare time, many of us fill that with watching competitive sports or playing competitive sports. So competition is everywhere. But one thing I find quite interesting looking into this subject in English, and I don't know in the other languages that are represented in the call, how this works, but the word competition in English, it has a Latin root. And the root meaning of the two words that gave us the word competition is with, com, and petere, which means to seek or to aim at. In English, we have the word petition. To make a petition is to make a request, to seek something. So you might write a petition to the government to ask them for something. In other words, the root meaning of this word, that when these words came together, was competere, meant to suit or to befit. The idea of the object matching the aim. Okay? So in other words, there is something we are seeking, We want to find the thing that will meet that need. So if you have a job, you want to find the person who will fit the need for that job. Of course, that is a very good thing. But somewhere along the line, the meaning morphed in the Latin language. Over time, the meaning changed so that competere began to be used more in the sense of striving for something. So not simply to find the thing that fits, but to strive towards the thing we are aiming at. And that is not a bad idea either, of course. Biblically, there's a lot about striving and working hard for the goal. But then when it came into English, and again, I can't speak for other languages, but this word competition came to be used for a challenge with a goal that only some people can win. And this is the key point where the meaning shifted, okay? Now it's no longer that we can all strive to achieve something or to be the best or to be fit for what we think is important. But now actually there's only some people who can win. And of course, eventually then the word compete, the verb compete, meant not just to strive for something, but to strive against other people. And that, I think, is where the problem comes in. So I want to say it like this, that sometimes when I talk to people about this idea of competing or competition, they say, but competition is good because it makes me strive for a goal. And I think what they're saying is this older meaning of the word competere, maybe they're Latin speakers, because they get that meaning that it's good to strive for a goal. But what I want us to explore is this second meaning that says that we strive against other people. So I want you just to reflect for a moment, to do a little exercise to say, where do you rank compared to other people on the chart of success? So thinking in ministry terms, if there is a chart from 0 to 10, where would you put yourself? And then what about competitiveness? How much is that part of you, your characteristic, your way of behaving, your way of thinking? Now, I'm trying to get you to think, because the success question, of course, raises another question, doesn't it? What is success? How do we define success? How do we measure that? But the reality is that sometimes when we come to conferences or we meet with other people in ministry, there is always this element of comparison. I don't know about you, maybe you don't experience that, but I've seen that in so many places, that the context seems to be that we have to compare. And then underlying this, the driver sometimes becomes competitiveness. So take a moment to think about that, and then we'll move on to think about where we see competition. Okay. So competitiveness is everywhere around us. And if you say, well, is competition a good thing? Then you will often get people who say, well, yes, there are benefits to competition. Competition encourages excellence, not just for the person who is competing, but for everybody. In other words, it raises everybody's standard. If you have competition, then everybody has to do better, to work harder, and surely that's a good thing. Or it maximizes the use of resources. There's only a limited amount of resource, so if we have people competing for the resources, it makes sure that everything gets used and gets used well. Or it motivates effort. It makes you try harder, okay? And I'm sure you've heard these arguments. I'm sure you maybe even have thought these things as well. And I want to say, I think there is some truth in this. I think it's undoubtedly true that competition can benefit things in society. I don't want to make this a seminar primarily about politics and the politics of left and right. That is obviously, that's part of how this works out. But I think we can recognize that somehow in our society, a level of competition seems to have some benefits. But of course, the other question is, at what cost do these benefits come? What is the cost of competition? Does it really encourage excellence for all? Is it really true that it maximizes the use of resources? Or at what point does it mean that some people get more resources than they need and other people don't have the basic needs that they have? Does it really motivate effort, or does it make some people give up and drop out and say, I can't compete, so I'm not going to try. So for every one of these benefits, there is also a negative side, a dark side to competition. But underlying this, I think, is the question, how does life work? Now, this is what one theologian, a very respectable theologian who has written many, many useful things, and I'm not trying to attack him or criticize him, but he wrote this about competition. He says, competition seems to be the system God intended when he gave people greater talents in one area and gave other people greater talents in another area, and when he established a world where justice and fairness would require giving greater reward for better work. What do you think of that statement? Well, I think it's true, isn't it, that God gives different talents, different abilities to different people. It might be true that, at least from our perspective, these talents look stronger or greater in some people than others. Although we might want to question that. Who are we to judge what is greater? Are we sure that we see these things the way that God sees them? What about the principle that everybody has a part to play in the body of Christ? But does the fact that some people are more gifted than others, does that automatically mean that we need competition? Does that mean that God has designed competitiveness? The idea that God has established a world where justice and fairness means giving greater reward for better work. Is that actually true? Is that biblical? Do we see that in Genesis before the fall? Do we see it in the teaching of Jesus? Well, actually, we see some things in the teaching of Jesus, like his parable about the workers who worked for different lengths of time but got the same pay, where there is something that actually goes against this principle, where there is a question of something that transcends fairness, perhaps. Now, please, again, I'm not saying that it is wrong that there is a difference in reward sometimes. Perhaps that might be okay. But really what I'm saying is I don't think that this argument works. I don't think that this argument is a real reason why we can say that God designed competition, because I think it neglects another word, which is cooperation. The fact that some people have greater gifts than others, well, surely that might just as easily mean that we need to cooperate with others to do an even better job. Or the fact that there is different levels of work and we have different abilities to work, different amounts, does that not mean that we should cooperate together? So how does life work? Well, the last quotation, I think, suggests something like this, which is really Darwin's basic idea, isn't it? That it's survival of the fittest. And in some ways, that's what has come over into the business world. It's what's come over into much of our thinking. The fittest survive, those who are best suited for the role. But is that the way the world really works? Or is it salvation through faith? Because if it's survival of the fittest, then what we need is grit, in the same sense as the film True Grit, okay? The idea that you need to be strong and powerful and successful and stick at it. But if the world ultimately really works by salvation through faith, then what we need is grace. And so sometimes I think what we're saying when we're describing the way the world works is we're describing a fallen world and not the way the kingdom of God works. And so what I'm most concerned about in this seminar is to ask, what are the implications for this, for how we think about ministry and church? And we'll come to that in the second part of the talk. But sports, maybe sports are a little bit of a parable of society, at least team sports, because in a team sport, you have two teams who compete against each other, but they do it within a set of rules. And so what you have in a team sport is cooperative competition. You have a team that is cooperating together, and you have two teams or more than two teams in a tournament who are also cooperating together because they agree to work within the rules, okay? That's a form of cooperation. But within this cooperation, they are competing. And it seems to me that that is a parable of the way that society in this fallen world works, that we recognize some cooperation is good, but we also recognize that competition can drive things. But if competition is left uncontrolled, then we need some rules to limit it. We can cooperate in competition, okay? That's just a thought about sport, but I'll come back to sport in a moment. What I want to do, though, is go right back to the beginning in Genesis. It seems to me that in Genesis 1 and 2, when God creates the world and when he creates humankind, there is no reference to competition. In chapter 1, God says, let us make man in our image and let them have dominion. Now, what you notice there is two forms of cooperation. You have the us of the triune God cooperating together in creation, and then you have them collectively having dominion, i.e., man and woman, humankind collectively fulfilling this responsibility. And then when we come to Genesis 2, when God creates the wife for Adam, he creates a helper who is fit for him, a helper, not a competitor, but someone who will be his co-worker, working together in harmony, in partnership, using what she brings, which he doesn't have, and he using what he has that she doesn't have, to work together. It's only in Genesis 3 that competition seems to come into the picture. Competition with God, first of all. Isn't that what the serpent says to Adam and Eve? He says, you will be like God. In other words, you can compete with God. You can take his position. You can take it on yourself to determine what is good and evil, to decide how morality works, to decide what is good and right for you. And competition between the sexes. In Genesis 3:16, your desire will be for your husband. He will rule over you. We don't have time to explore that verse, but there is something that has gone wrong in this relationship where it is no longer partnership in harmony, but somehow there is conflict between the sexes. Conflict within families, of course, Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? Not cooperation, but actually my brother is a rival to me. And between nations, eventually in Genesis 11, the confusion of the languages enhances what is already there because of sin, where actually their cooperation in building the tower is directed against God, and God confuses them so that there will be, in some level, competition between the nations, because when they compete, they're going to compete against God in rivalry with him. But skip forward, and we're not in Genesis any longer, now into the book of Exodus, but still under this theme of where did competition come? The first commandment in the 10 commandments says, you will have no other gods before me. That has something to say about competition, doesn't it? The root responsibility to love the Lord our God with all of our being, every part of our being, to have no other gods. God will have no rivals, no competitors. There is a singleness of worship. And the last of the 10 commandments is what? You shall not covet. You shall not covet. That is wrapping off the 10 commandments with a statement that is about the root issue that underlies competition between people. As the cartoon, if you can read that, says humorously, I understand. That's Moses saying to God, oh, I understand. With the coveting part, we can get everybody. Okay, in other words, that, you know, you can read the list of commandments and you could almost tick them to say, yeah, I've kept that one. But it's coveting that gets to the heart, that says to us that actually the issue that we have with sin is much deeper. It's not simply about the things that we do, it's about the attitude of the heart. So I think that the 10 commandments are framed with statements that are about competing against God, or competing in our worship, having other gods competing with God, and competing with each other. And the love for God and love for others that are the meaning of the 10 commandments excludes the idea of seeing God in competitive terms or of seeing others in competitive terms. Another little comment, and then we'll take a break for some questions, but a lesson from history. This idea of muscular Christianity, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, But muscular Christianity was a movement that really was birthed in the 1800s, especially in England. Now, I have to be careful here. Maybe there are some English people listening. I'm an Irishman. This is not, I hope at least, this is not a kind of correction from the fringes from Ireland. But the reality is that it was especially in England that this idea was born, but also very influential in America. And the idea of muscular Christianity came from the writings of people like Thomas Hughes, who wrote books about Tom Brown and his school days, Charles Kingsley, who was a Church of England clergyman, but who also wrote some novels. He wrote a book called The Water Babies, which was capturing this idea of muscular Christianity. And Thomas Arnold, who became the headmaster of a new school that was formed at the end of the 1700s called Rugby School, which is where the game rugby was invented. And Thomas Arnold was a champion of muscular Christianity. The idea was this, and there was a good idea at the beginning of it, I think. The idea was that we don't simply want to develop people in their faith, in their souls, but we also want to develop them physically, because if people are physically strong and healthy and disciplined, then their spiritual health will be better. They will be better fitted to serve other people, to do good in the world. And this idea was about combining the development of spiritual faith in God with physical strength so that we can do good in the world, was very much at the root of the English public school system. Rugby was one of the English public schools, still is, together with others like Eton and Harrow and so on. But out of this movement was also born a number of Christian organizations, the YMCA, most obviously and less directly, the Salvation Army, the BB and other uniformed organizations, which all had this idea of emphasizing the physical strength and well-being of young people, as well as their spiritual development. Now, as I've said, I think that began with a good idea. Here was the idea expressed in one of those books about Tom Brown by Thomas Hughes. The least of the muscular Christians has hold of the old chivalrous and Christian belief that a man's body is given him to be trained and brought into subjection and then used for the protection of the weak, the advancement of all righteous causes, and the subduing of the earth, which God has given to the children of men. There is something very good in that, something very true, that God has given us our bodies to use them for his purpose. The advancement of what is righteous and good, the subduing of the earth, that goes back to Genesis, doesn't it? But the problem that came in, I think, is this. If you push this idea to its full extent, then where does it leave the weak people? Where does it leave the people whose bodies are not able to be so strong? The people with disabilities? Where does it leave the people who don't have the intellectual ability, or who don't have the social opportunity to go to a school, a public school like Rugby, or in this novel, one of the later novels by Thomas Hughes, Tom Brown at Oxford? They don't have the capacity to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And actually what happened in the English context is that this idea of muscular Christianity became so connected with the idea of the advancement of civilization was the righteous cause, that one writer could say this in 1901, if asked what our muscular Christianity has done, we point to the British Empire. In effect, what was happening in the English public school system and in the Oxbridge system was that people were being trained for the empire, to become the administrators and the generals and the people who could advance the empire, trained for leadership, trained to be strong, to be powerful, to be disciplined. Now, I'm not going to make a comment about the British Empire, except that I think most of us would recognize that imperialism is a very dangerous thing, when national interest tends to take over from some of the good things that are in the quote at the top of the screen, it becomes reduced to something that is about advancing power for the powerful and not for those who are weaker. And the interesting thing is this, that the English school system, maybe that quote is not quite right. It's not only the British Empire, but the legacy of the British Empire, which is most of the team sports that are popular around the world, which were created in the same English public school system that gave the British Empire its leaders. And if you're thinking, well, that's not all of the sports, whether it's association football, cricket, rugby, football, golf had a Scottish origin, but was spread through the empire, hockey, even tennis as it's played today. Well, what about some other sports like basketball and volleyball? Well, the interesting thing is that both of those sports were invented in North America by YMCA instructors, very much born out of this muscular Christianity movement. And the idea, I suppose, is this. Now in the modern world, in those days, it was on the sports field that you learned the values of competition, strength, and teamwork that you carried with you into the military to fight the wars you were going to fight for the empire. Now we see these things as an alternative to imperialism. Let's not fight with each other. Let's just play it out on the football pitch or in the Olympics or whatever it might be. But of course, the value of competition is woven into these sports. And one question I might ask is, what influence does it have on us in ministry if our lives are so full with these values of competition? So the questions are, what is the cost of the benefits of competition and who pays it? And have you seen harmful competitiveness in national, political, or cultural identities, in family relationships, in sexual or romantic relationships? And to what extent do these reflect an underlying competition with God for glory?